Pokemon TCG is no stranger to gimmicks. Pretty much every year, a new gimmick or two is introduced to hopefully spice things up a bit. Sometimes these completely change how the game is played. Other times, not so much. With the introduction of the Stellar type in Scarlet and Violet's DLC, the TCG followed suit in creating Stellar Terra cards. Each of these cards would have a rainbow border, one normal attack or ability, and a second incredibly powerful attack that costs at least 3 energy of different types. Today I want to talk about these cards and how they were kind of total flops in the TCG. The first few Stellar Terra came around in the Stellar Crown set and already began to illustrate what I mean. Take Lapras EX for example. Its first attack, Power Splash, does 40 damage for each energy attached to it. That's a fine attack. Before a Water, Psychic, and a Metal energy, Larimar Rain lets you look at the top 20 cards of your deck and accelerate all the energy you find there, however you like. That's really strong, except by the time you've put 3 energy of different types on this thing, you probably could have set up any other Pokemon way more easily. This card has seen very little competitive play, but some people did try playing it in Gen Pow decks. Keep in mind Baxcalibur can allow you to accelerate as much water energy as you like onto this thing to allow Power Splash to hit for pretty big numbers. That said, these decks didn't even bother playing the Metal or the Psychic energy needed to use Larimar Rain. This card only ever saw any usage for its first attack. This is what I mean when I say these cards have failed. The entire point of Stellar Terras were these huge, flashy, multicolor attacks. If they were constantly being ignored by the wider player base, then the mechanic itself doesn't really have much of a reason to exist, does it? By the way, according to YouTube, 9,572.4% of my viewers are not subscribed. I'm not really sure how that happens, but I think that's really bad, so please subscribe. This should not be this way. Right now though, let's talk about some of the other cards here. And just for fun, we'll put a little counter down at the bottom. If a card saw real success and used a stellar attack to get that success, we'll add a point. Cinderace, at a glance, seems alright. Layer Strike and Garnet Volley can be used for the same energy cost, and alternating between the two every turn seems pretty strong. I've seen people online insist this card is good, but unfortunately, that's not true. This card is quite bad. It's just a lot of work to set up a stage 2 and get 3 energy on it. And now that energy has to be 3 different types? Come on. Obviously that's not going to happen. Even if you could get the energy onto it consistently, Garnet Volley honestly doesn't seem that worth it. Compare this card to something like Wellspring Mask Ogerpon EX. Ogerpon is a basic, so it's easier to get onto the board. Torrential Pump costs a water and 2 colorless, which is way easier than a fire fighting and a dark. And Torrential Pump sure only does 120 to the bench, but it also does 100 to the active, meaning it's way easier to take multiple knockouts and pick apart the opponent's board. Garnet Volley doing 180 instead of 120 really isn't that relevant. Any Terra Pokemon EX doesn't care at all thanks to the built-in bench barrier, and most bench-sitting EXs would just get 2-shot by both Torrential Pump and Garnet Volley. For anything else, it's probably overkill. I understand Torrential Pump does force you to shuffle the energy back into the deck, but that drawback is not nearly as bad as all the hoops you have to jump through just to get Cinderace set up in the first place. This is the other major flaw with the Stellar Terras. Not only are these attacks difficult to set up, sometimes they're just worse than other available cards. Like if Garnet Volley did decent damage to the active while also hitting the bench for 180, this would be a very powerful attack. But it doesn't do that. Every meta-relevant stage 2 right now either accelerates energy to itself, can attack for super cheap, or has some consistency ability elsewhere in its evolution line to help it get set up. Cinderace has none of these, and the Cinderace from Mega Evolution doesn't count. I'm sorry. Let's move on. Stellar Crown also gave us Galvantula EX. Galvantula was actually hyped up when it was revealed, and specifically for its second attack. Fulgurite requires 3 energy of different types, and discards all 3 after you worked so hard to set them up. But it does item lock. In a pre-Bidoof world, this was pretty appealing. However, you can imagine that's a lot of work, and denying your opponent items for 1 turn won't set them back nearly as much as you just set yourself back by discarding 3 energy for just 180 damage. No, Galvantula would eventually see play in Joltik box decks for other reasons. First off, just being Galvantula made it very easy to play as an evolution to your feeble little Joltik, but Charged Web still hits EXs for 220, which is a very good number for taking out Ogerpons or Phesantipodes. Even then though, this card is only a niche tech card for Joltik box decks. It's not bad at all, but if you're evolving your Joltik, you're also competing with the Galvantula from Shrouded Fable, which only gives up 1 prize card and can one-shot Grassweak EXs. In any case, the decks that saw success with this card didn't even run the energy to use Fulgurite in the first place. It didn't factor into this card's success at all. The final Terra of the set though was its headliner, Terapagos EX. Terapagos is a bit of a different story from the other three. This card saw tons of competitive play. Admittedly, a lot of that was just because it was a basic Terra Pokemon, but the attack of 2 colorless for Unified Beatdown made it very splashable in all sorts of decks. Early on, you would combo this with double Turbo Energy to make its Unified Beatdown attack pretty easy to use turn after turn, and you could take hits with the help of cards like Buffalant. Later on, this card would see play alongside cards like Charizard EX. The important thing here is that Terapagos being a basic Terra allowed for Area 0 Underdepth to stay available even if you didn't have your other Terra Pokemon in play. Plus, these Pokemon could very easily charge up Terapagos as an attacker if you really needed to. More importantly though, Noctowl's Jewel Seeker ability is incredibly powerful, allowing you to grab any 2 trainer cards from your deck if you have a Terra Pokemon in play. If you're using Noctowl, you absolutely need to have a basic Terra Pokemon to throw down to easily enable it when needed. For many decks, Terapagos filled that role. Now, you may have noticed that I haven't even mentioned Terapagos' Crown Opal attack yet. Well, this is still a little bit awkward. All it does is 180 damage to prevent damage from basic non-colorless Pokemon, so the vast majority of decks don't care about that effect. Plus, Unified Beatdown will oftentimes be able to do more damage than Crown Opal ever would, thanks to Area 0 Underdepth. That said though, decks using Terapagos would often play all sorts of different energy types. Combine that with the A-Spec Sparkling Crystal, and these decks were more than capable of using Crown Opal if they really needed to. So while this card probably would have seen just as much usage if Crown Opal didn't exist, you also just had this neat little bonus attack that could instantly wall your opponent out of the game if they were playing a specific deck. Sure, it didn't come up like 90% of the time, but it did come up and it was good, and it almost certainly won games at higher level competitive events, at least at some point. So it'd be wrong not to give any credit for this. That said, one card using its attack in niche situations out of 4 is not a great start. Surging Sparks would come around to serve as a second chance to make Stellar Terras work. Do they succeed? Well, at least I think the second wave is a much better attempt than the first. I want to talk about Ceruledge first. This is a Stellar Terra that actually sees a ton of play. Abyssal Flames does 30 damage plus 20 more for each energy in the discard pile. By just building a deck to flood the discard with energies, you can hit pretty big numbers relatively easily. Its second attack, Raging Amethyst, is really bad though. Way too much work just to swing for 280. A proper Ceruledge deck will often find itself swinging for more than 280 with Abyssal Flames alone. It almost feels like they gave up with a second attack here. In fact, Raging Amethyst serves as an active detriment to this card. Mew EX and Team Rocket's Mimikyu can use their attacks to copy Raging Amethyst and take an easy one-shot on Ceruledge. This is a card that would be objectively better if its second attack did not exist. This card actively suffers for being a Stellar Terra. Honestly, I kind of want to remove a point for this, but I won't do that. It's just a really sad situation here. In Japan, Ceruledge was originally released in starter decks that came out alongside Sylveon EX, which we'll get to, but I want to talk about that later. For right now, let's talk about some of the other cards in Surging Sparks. Palisand is terrible. Sand Tomb is just really bad, and while Bright Jail is a very unique and powerful attack, you have to put in the work to fully set up Palisand, as well as some other Pokemon that can take that remaining 100 HP on your opponent's Pokemon. Just not happening. Lygon Sonic Peridot is hard countered by the built-in bench barrier that every Terra Pokemon has, and while some people tried to build decks using Reversing Storm to pivot into a wall like Mimikyu, it just never got anywhere. Cyclizar? Yikes. Alolan Exeggutor EX is a very funny card though. This card has seen competitive play and has seen that play for its second attack. Kind of. There certainly was an idea behind this card. You could get it out turn 1 going first thanks to Execute's Precocious Evolution attack. And Tropical Frenzy is, in theory, decent acceleration, but requiring 2 energy of different types just to use makes it a little bit awkward. Now, Swing's Fiend for a grass, water, and fighting makes you flip a coin, already off to a bad start, and if heads, your opponent's active basic Pokemon is knocked out. But tails let you take out one of their benched basics. So if your opponent has both a basic in the active and on a bench, this attack is always taking a knockout. Unfortunately, this is just really bad on Exeggutor. If your opponent is playing an evolution deck, the odds of you getting value out of this attack is pretty low. And because you need to use so many different energy types to get this going, there's really not much room to fit in a proper backup plan here. So how and why were people using Alolan Exeggutor? Well, Regidrago V-Star is a card that existed in Standard alongside Alolan Exeggutor for only a few months, but Regidrago's Apex Dragon attack lets you copy the attacks of any Dragon Pokemon in your discard pile, regardless of the original energy cost. Suddenly, Exeggutor being situational isn't really a big deal anymore. But yeah, Exeggutor's whole purpose was to get dumped into the discard pile, so Regidrago could potentially copy its attacks if you really needed either of them. Sorry buddy. Since this card was only used with a way to bypass the energy cost and wasn't even meant to hit the field, I'll only give it half a point, and to be honest, I think that's being generous. Surging Sparks really isn't looking any better yet, but there are 3 more cards to go over, and all of them actually legitimately use their stellar attacks. I actually think all 3 of these cards are very cool, so let's talk about them. Tatsugiri EX's Cinnabar Lord lets you look at the top 10 cards of your deck and put any Pokemon Pokemon you find there onto your bench. That's it. You can play a deck with this as your only basic, and a bunch of extremely powerful stage 2s. Then try to turbo out Cinnabar lore to get those insane stage 2s onto your bench en masse. So this never saw any real competitive success, but it was really funny. Obviously, you could turbo out stuff like Togekiss or Dusknoir or whatever. When Ascended Heroes gave us Anthea and Concordia, this was a very funny way to try and get all the Ents Pokemon in play to enable that. And you can imagine in expanded format, there are some truly disgusting things you can do by playing this card. That said though, the energy cost is still very inconsistent. The HPs on Tatsugiri is just very low, and you just need to get lucky to have the cards you need in the top 10. A lot needs to go right, and unfortunately Tatsugiri was never actually a good card. That said, the first real winner here is Hydreigon EX. Hydreigon EX is a card that I don't really think is very good, but pretty much everyone at least wants this card to be good. Obsidian for a Psychic, Darkness, Metal, and a colorless energy, because apparently these attacks aren't expensive enough, lets you hit the active and 2 of your opponent's bench Pokemon for 130 damage. This attack is insane if you can get it up and running early. Of course, the issue is if you get out a stage 2 and put 4 energy onto it all before your opponent can set up themselves, you are going to win anyway. Still though, Crashing Headbutt is a solid enough attack. Milling 3 can sometimes deny your opponent an important resource, but that's about it. This card sometimes sneaks its way into day 2 of larger events, if it can get lucky enough. Still, every deck built around it kind of looks like a big pile of cards to me. You're really just depending on drawing exactly what you need to get this combo up and running early. It's super inconsistent, super funny if it gets going though. And most importantly, this is a card that saw legitimate competitive success entirely because this stellar attack. So let's give credit where it's due. But now it's time to talk about the actual good card. Here's Pikachu EX. Pikachu EX's only attack is its flashy stellar attack. In place of a regular attack, it has an ability. Resolute Heart means this card can never be one-hit KO'd. Combined with the Terra bench barrier, and this is a very good ability. It can still be broken through with Phantom Dive or something, but certain decks are literally incapable of one-hit KOing this guy. And what about this attack? For a Grass, Lightning, and Metal, Topaz Bolt does 300 damage, but requires you to discard 3 energy. This is actually pretty good, entirely because we have Joltik. Pikachu is a premier attacker in Joltik box decks. Joltik can accelerate multiple Grass and Lightning onto Pikachu, so all you need to do is attach that Metal, and you're up and running. Yes, discarding 3 is still a very hefty cost, but Joltik can attach 4, so, you know, and 300 damage is taking out basically everything in the game with the help of Gravity Mountain. Even with Megas came around with their super inflated HP numbers, we got Light Ball to help deal with those too. It's kind of just basic math here, right? Pikachu attacks once and probably takes 2 or maybe even 3 prize cards. Your opponent retaliates, but they literally can't take this card out in one hit, and then during your next turn you can either retreat into another attacker or maybe even attack with Pikachu again if you have the right setup. This card can create huge favorable trades that pretty much win you the game on the spot. Pikachu is pretty much unequivocally the perfect example of a Stellar Terra done right, but going 1 for 20 isn't really enough to save the mechanic. That said, I think they started to finally get the hang of things with Prismatic Evolutions. This is the final set to give us Stellar Terras, providing Stellar Terras for Eevee and each of its evolutions. Let's talk about some of these. So, you remember how Terapagos served as a basic Terra to throw down to enable Knockdown or Area Zero or whatever? Well, that was Eevee's whole purpose too. For a Fire, Water, and Lightning, Coruscating Quartz swings for 200. Yeah. This attack is only here out of obligation. The ability Rainbow DNA allows this Eevee to evolve into any of the Eeveelution EXs, because normally they can only evolve from regular Eevee, not Eevee EX. If you're crazy enough, you can use 4 of this and 4 of your regular Eevee to get all 8 Eeveelutions on the board at once, and being an evolving basic with a bench barrier and 200 HP isn't bad at all. But this card is really only a Stellar Terra to fit in theme with the other Stellar Terras. Now, let's talk about the Eeveelutions. Let's start with Flareon EX, because this is a very, very important card to consider when talking about the other Eeveelutions we have here. For a Fire and a Colorless, Burning Charge does 130 damage and accelerates 2 basic energy of any type onto one of your Pokemon. For a Fire, Water, and Lightning, Carnelian does 280 damage and stops you from attacking during your next turn. Carnelian is good enough for what it is. Eevee decks do rely on this attack on a regular basis, so we'll give it a point there. More importantly though, Burning Charge. 2 basic energy of any type. As long as Flareon is up and running early, charging up the other Stellar Terras becomes way easier. This card is pretty much the glue that holds the other Eeveelutions together. Not only does this make the underperformance of the previous Stellar Terras even more pathetic, but it also makes the Eeveelutions that much better. While Flareon and Eevee were must-haves in any Eevee deck, the others all kind of came down to personal preference, depending on what you thought you might face. Let's talk about them. First, I do want to cover Sylveon because it came out a while ago at this point. Sylveon saw very little play until Flareon would come around to help give it a lift. Although even back then, some people are just built different. Now, Magical Charm does underwhelming damage and weakens the defending Pokemon, But Angelite is the real fun one here. For Water, Lightning, and Psychic, you gotta shuffle 2 of your opponent's bench Pokemon right back into the deck. You just can't use this attack 2 turns in a row. Sure, you're not taking any prize cards, but annihilating your opponent's board like this will ideally put them back far enough for you to win anyway. As a result, this card saw decent play, and it's entirely because of that stellar attack. This is a very fun card, and I like it a lot. Vaporeon EX is pretty bad, unfortunately. Severe Squall does 60 damage to all of your opponent's Pokemon EX, which is only a 3-shot on even the most fragile EXs in the game, while all Terra EXs on the bench are just immune. Not great. Its second attack with Aquamarine is identical to Carnelian, so you're better off just sticking with Flareon. Jolteon EX has a similar issue. Dravite is identical to Carnelian, so again, just use Flareon. Flashing Sphere, however, can hit up to 240 damage if you can discard 2 energy from your bench Pokemon. This is at least a lot better than whatever Vaporeon's got going on, but it's still not that impactful. Theoretically, if Eevee decks were to become good again, maybe this card would see usage to help hit stuff like Mega Starmie and Mega Greninja, but as it is right now, both Vaporeon and Jolteon saw next to no use. It's a real shame because I understand the theme of, a water, fire, and lightning being shared across the 3 Kanto evolutions to use the same attack. Like, that's cool, but it would be a lot cooler if these cards actually did something unique, Now, Espeon, I suppose, is better than those two, but it's still not particularly great. Psych Out does 160 damage and discards a random card, which isn't bad by any means, but it does feel a tiny bit expensive for what it is. Amazes devolves all of your opponent's Pokemon by shuffling the highest stage into the deck. This is pretty cool, but Angelite is generally just better. For devolving your opponent's board, Tactical Machine Devolution would only return those Pokemon to the hand, but it's certainly a lot easier to use. I think there could have been some kind of vision here for a deck that uses Vaporeon to put damage on your opponent's EXs and then evolve them with Espeon to knock out all of the lower HP pre-evolutions. But again, the built-in bench barrier for Terra EXs makes a strategy like that kind of hard to use, so Amazes was never really used either. Umbreon, though, has actually seen decent competitive success. Moonmirage is, again, underwhelming for its cost, only dealing 160 damage and causing confusion, while Onyx makes you discard all energy attached to it to take a prize card. I'm sure Onyx could come up sometimes, but just taking a prize card feels pretty bad when you could knock out an EX, take 2 prize cards, destroy your opponent's board, and just create that much more progress. No, the actual reason this card saw play was entirely for Moonmirage. Being a dark type meant this card could be used to hit psychic types like Gardevoir or Jellicent for weakness, turning Moonmirage into an easy way to take one-shots. The decks that played Umbreon at least ran the energy to use Onyx if they needed to, but to be completely clear, people weren't actually using Onyx. This attack is really bad. I guess it beats that stupid Kangaskhan Fortress deck though. Anyway, let's talk about Leafeon EX. Leafeon is one of the better evolutions here. The almighty Verdant Storm does 60 damage for each energy on the opponent's board. This can get pretty huge pretty fast, plus being a grass type allows this Pokemon to hit a lot of good cards for tons of damage thanks to weakness. For a grass, fire, and water, Mossagate does 230 damage and heals 100 from each of your bench Pokemon. Yeah, this is a little situational, but it's still pretty good. A lot of dark decks make use of Munkidori to spread damage throughout the opponent's board. Leafeon not only hits those dark decks for weakness, but Mossagate heals your bench, undoing a lot of the progress that Munkidori just did. This is a very, very powerful card against decks like Grimmsnarl, for example. Overall, Leafeon is probably the second best evolution behind Flareon, and Mossagate plays a very legitimate role in that. And finally, we have Glaceon. Glaceon is bad. The idea here is you use Frost Bullet twice, then use Euclase to knock out what you sniped with Frost Bullet. If you want to use an attack like Frost Bullet, just play Grimmsnarl. And if you want to use an attack like Euclase, just use Mega Absol. Like Mega Absol, this card theoretically pairs nicely with Munkidori, but unlike Mega Absol, this energy cost, oh my gosh. So this is once again a card that never saw any real use. So let's check our progress here. So out of 21 Stellar Terra cards, we have a grand total of kind of 6.5 being good, and half of those are evolutions. Yeah, that's kind of gross. This does beg the question though as to why these cards are just so bad. Well, obviously consistency is a big issue. Having to run energy of multiple types means you have to play way more energy overall, and you have to see the right types at the right time too. There were a number of cards designed to help out with this, like Crispin or Sparkling Crystal, but that plays into the next issue, the Dragapult EX. So it's not necessarily Dragapult specifically, but Dragapult is really the best example of this. You see, Dragapult is a very good card, but it's not a Stellar Terra at all. It's a regular Terra Pokemon whose Dragon typing means its attacks just so happen to require 2 different types. In this case, Fire and Psychic. So any support card meant for the Stellar Terras could instead just be used by Dragapults, often to greater effect. Not only does Dragapult need less energy to use Phantom Dive, but honestly, Phantom Dive is kind of better than a lot of these stellar attacks we talked about. So as a result, Dragapult is pretty much the embodiment of the issue with all these Stellar Terras here. Requiring many different types of energy makes these cards objectively worse than cards that don't. But those other cards are often capable of using the Stellar Terra support just as well, if not better, than Stellar Terras, because not only are they more consistent inherently, but they'll also just have a better payoff. But this isn't the first time the game has experimented with expensive tricolor attack costs, and it certainly won't be the last. But these mechanics are just so difficult to make good. You'd have to push a mechanic like this very hard just to make it good. And unfortunately for Stellar Terras, they didn't last long enough to really have that much of an impact on the game. Anyway, that's all. Thank you. If you want me to talk about something else, comment, subscribe.